this unlocks so many new visual things that I could do that I couldn't do before.
Okay, see this glow effect right here on the new Framer website? I think it is so cool. So I caught up with the person who designed it, and Jure from Framer is going to give us a little behind the scenes to show us exactly how he brought it to life in Framer.
Initially, we didn't have this. It was like, looks pretty stark and black, and like we need to get some Framer vibe back in there. So we added this back, but I set this up in a very different way initially. So this is just an empty frame, and we have this feature called realistic shadows. So you can add shadows just like any other design tool to your layers. And most design tools will default to box, which you know from CSS, if you're familiar with that. We also have a realistic shadow. So you've seen people post things on Twitter or Dribbble or whatever going like, this is how you create the perfect layered shadow in Figma. And it's like 20 different layers with different types of opacity and different blurs. And it'll create this beautiful sort of like realistic looking shadow. This pretty much does the same thing, but it's baked into Framer. So you don't have to worry about, oh my God, I have to duplicate like 20 different layers or look up this tutorial on how to do it. But you can do some really interesting stuff with this. You can also create a very sort of like weird glowy effect if you set it as an inner or shadow inside or inner shadow. So I went, what if I just like set like an inner shadow, make it that Framer blue, which is near 09F. You can already see it show up at the top, but then it just went like this. I set the Y value to really high, which sort of like creates this upward glowing thing. And you can play with like diffusion, so make it a little bit like more spread out. You can also see if I set the focus to like very low, you can essentially see what this is. It's a bunch of layers layered on top of each other that get different blur values. So this is great for like making very cool shadows and glowy stuff. But then you end up with the issue that it sort of like cuts off at the top, right? So we have this feature called mask. You can add it here, but I already have one added actually. And mask is just CSS mask. To explain this in a very simple way, it's like you can sort of like fade things out. You can also mask things through images. So dive into masks if you want to learn more. But this is basically how you can fade entire layers to different levels of opacity in a very simple way. You can also make like fading or progressive blur values and stuff like that. But that is sort of how I did this thing. So then you don't have those rough edges anymore. So you can, if you set this to 100, you can still see what that looked like. But if you set it to 0, you sort of get this effect. And that sort of brings you very close to what I had before. The problem with this is, going back to like website and browser performance again, this is not super performant because like I've shown, if you set that focus value to very high, you can see it's a bunch of layers. Those get blurs applied to it. Browsers don't like it if you do too much of that. So even though it's not showing that it has blur on it, there's a bunch of blur on this. There's a bunch of extra layers. So even though it looks great, it's rendering a bunch of layers that the browser is not going to like. So if you don't have like a very powerful PC or a very powerful Mac, it might struggle with this. So you want to be careful with stuff like this. But this is sort of how I went, wait, but this is an interesting effect. Let me try to recreate this with layers that are a little less expensive for the browser. So that's how I got to the new one, which is essentially just a bunch of linear gradients combined with that mask feature again. So if we break it down.
Hey, it's Rid. If you like this video, then I have some pretty good news because this is actually just a bonus clip. We have the official behind the scenes of the new Framer site on the Dive Club YouTube channel. This is where I'm hosting all of my interviews with today's top designers, people like Jordan Singer, Jenny Wen, Brad Frost, and founding designers at really, really interesting companies like Linear, Perplexity, even the browser company. So definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Okay, let's get back into it.
There is one layer called BG, which is the background. It is just a linear gradient going from a darker blue value to nothing. But like I've shown before, if you don't have that mask feature on there, it's going to look a little bit more like this. But that's where I combine linear and radial gradients with the mask. So you can do more with gradients if you combine them with the mask feature that we have. This is one of those examples where I tweaked it for an hour until I was like, now it's just right. And I'll probably tweak it again tomorrow because I'll look at it and it's like, oh, it's still not great. So we have that background layer, which is just a linear gradient and then has a radial mask on it. And then there's a second layer, which adds a little bit of a lighter glow and also has a radial gradient on it, or a radial mask, I should say. And then it's that final layer, which is sort of like a smaller, lighter glow, which sort of like comes up from the bottom a little bit. So it is very hard to say, why did I do it this way? Because it looks good. And I've been tweaking it because it looks good. I've been tweaking it like this for an hour. There's no like, this is how to make the definitive glow gradient tutorial. Just throw a bunch of layers on top of each other. Make sure you don't use a ton of blur, so it's very expensive for the browser. And then that final touch was like the edge that I added to it. And you can't really see it right now, but we have this cool effect that I added to the parent layer, which has all those gradient layer, which is the glow. There's like the appear effect. So if the page loads, it slowly sort of like fades in that glow. And then we also have this scroll transform, which is you can transform layers based on if you're scrolling or if certain sections are in view. So this is a little bit complicated, but there's a scroll section called nav trigger, which is essentially these layers. The reason I called this nav trigger is because by default, our navigation is transparent. So it has 0 opacity, so you can see parts of the video through it. But as soon as I reach this text, I want to change the navigation variant from transparent to the normal one. So you can also switch variant based on scroll positions, etc. But I already had this scroll section called nav trigger. So I was like, I'll just trigger some animation of this glow based on if this text is going to hit the top of the page. So I added a scroll transform section in view. So if this section is in view, and I actually set it to the middle of the page, so my bad, it's not the top of the page, but you can switch that here. So if this section, the bottom of this section hits the middle of the viewport, it's going to transform some layers. So that's what I did with this glow. It goes from opacity 1 and scale 1, which is the default, to opacity 0. So you can change this value and see what happens. And it moves it down by 100 pixels. So if you set this to opacity 1, and you can tweak this, you can see that it just moves the layer down by 100 pixels and then also fades it out. So then if you go into the preview, you can see that it sort of like brings in that glow with that appear animation. And then as you start scrolling down and this layer starts moving in your viewport, remember that scroll trigger, which was called nav trigger, or scroll section called nav trigger. As this layer starts changing in your viewport, the glow below is going to change. So it sort of like goes to opacity 0. It also fades out a little bit. And then I had this sort of like tiny 1 pixel line that I added, which fades out slightly later. So it looks like the edge of the next section is sort of being lit up by that glow. And then obviously you can replay those layers. So you can either play them one or you can replay them. So if you scroll back up, it's just going to return to the initial value. So very simple, but very powerful. You can, like I said, tweak it for hours or just slap the default value on there and call it a day.
It's so cool. I really appreciate this little tutorial, and well done. My biggest takeaway is, man, I got to start playing with these radial masks more. Those are super powerful.
Yeah. When we shipped the feature, I was like, cool. And then I started trying it. I was like, wait, this unlocks so many things, which makes it simpler, but also, like I said, I became a better web designer by getting some of the features that we now have in Framer, and masks is one of those things. So I'm like, this unlocks so many new visual things that I could do that I couldn't do before. It's just a great example of like a very simple feature that looks very simple on the surface, but unlocks so many creative things.